400 feet beneath the Sea of Okhotsk, American divers wrapped a listening device around a Soviet naval cable. They did not cut it. They did not pierce it. They simply held it and listened. And for years, the men who authorized this operation believed it was one of the best-kept secrets the United States had ever placed on the ocean floor. They were wrong about how long it would stay hidden. Because the weakest point in the operation was never the cable. It was a man who remembered too much. First, understand what it took to get a listening device onto a cable that no map would show you. The Sea of Okhotsk sits between the Soviet mainland and the Kamchatka Peninsula. Cold water, enclosed. For the Soviet Navy, it was something close to a private lake. The Pacific Fleet operated there, and running along the seabed was a communications cable connecting Soviet naval facilities in that region. A cable the Soviets trusted. That trust is the key to the entire story. Because the people who laid that cable made an assumption. They assumed no one could reach it. They assumed that 400 feet of cold, dark, heavily monitored water was protection enough. They assumed that a cable running through their own home waters did not need the same encryption discipline as a message sent over the open air. Why encrypt what no enemy can touch? That assumption is what the United States decided to test. The operation was called Ivy Bells, a United States undersea signals intelligence operation. Its target was Soviet undersea communications cables during the Cold War. And the heart of it, the mission the public accounts return to again and again, took place in the early 1970s. To reach that cable, the Americans needed more than nerve. They needed a submarine that could do something submarines were not built to do. Not attack, not hide and wait, but stop, sit on the bottom, and release divers into open water at depth. The submarine associated with that initial cable tap mission was the USS Halibut, a modified boat. Modified in ways that were themselves closely guarded. Because a submarine that can hover over a precise point on the seabed and hold there, steady, while divers work below it, is not a normal warship. It is a platform for something else. Consider the problem in front of the planners. Somewhere on the floor of the Sea of Okhotsk was a cable. Not marked. Not lit. Buried in silt in places, exposed in others. You could not simply drive out and find it. You had to know it was there. You had to narrow it down. And here the public accounts describe a kind of detective work. The Americans reasoned that a cable coming ashore would be protected on land by warning signs. Signs telling fishermen and passing ships not to anchor there. Do not drag your nets. Do not drop your anchor. There is something below. A sign meant to protect the cable also announces the cable. And so the search began near the shoreline, working outward, following the logic of a line that had to run somewhere. This is the texture of the operation that so often gets lost. Before any listening device touched anything, there was patience. There was the slow, careful mapping of a seabed inside an enemy's most sensitive waters. Every hour the submarine spent in the Sea of Okhotsk was an hour spent inside Soviet naval defenses. Detection would not have meant embarrassment. It would have meant a United States submarine caught sitting on the bottom of Soviet home waters, doing something it could not possibly explain. Now hold that image, and remember the first loop. Someone, years later, would tell the Soviets exactly what was happening down there. But in the early 1970s, no one on the American side imagined that. They were focused on the water in front of them. When the cable was finally located, the divers went to work. And here the design of the device itself is worth slowing down for. Because the elegance of Ivy Bells is not in force, it is in restraint. The tap is described in public accounts as an induction device. That word matters. Induction. It means the device did not have to cut the cable. It did not have to pierce the insulation. It did not have to break into the line at all. An electrical current running through a cable creates a magnetic field around it. A field that leaks, faintly, into the water and metal surrounding the wire. An induction device reads that field. It listens to the echo of the signal without ever touching the signal itself. Think about what that means for the Soviets. There was no break in the line, no drop in performance, no damaged section for a repair crew to find. The cable worked exactly as it always had. Every test the Soviets could run would come back normal. Because nothing had been broken. Something had simply been wrapped around it in the dark, listening. This is the quiet dread at the center of the whole affair. A perfectly functioning system that has already been compromised. A conversation that feels private because the line is intact. The device sat on the cable and recorded. Naval communications. Traffic connected to the Soviet Pacific Fleet area around the Sea of Okhotsk and Kamchatka. The very messages the Soviets felt safe sending, precisely because they believed the water protected them. But a recording on the seabed is only useful if you can get it back. And this is where the operation stopped being a single dramatic dive and became something far more demanding. Something that had to happen again and again. The operation depended on specialized submarine modifications. It depended on diver access at depth, and it depended on repeated retrieval or servicing of the recorded material. That word, repeated, is the one that turns a clever trick into a long-running exposure. Because the device did not transmit its take across the ocean in real time. The recordings had to be physically collected, which meant coming back. Returning to that same patch of Soviet seabed, sending divers down to the same cable, swapping out what had been captured. Every return was a fresh chance to be discovered. Every mission carried the same risk as the first, and the longer the operation ran, the more valuable it became, and the more men and hardware were staked on it staying secret. You can see the shape of the trap forming even without knowing the ending. An operation that succeeds by being repeated is an operation that lives on borrowed time. Its security does not depend only on the ocean. It depends on every single person who knows it exists. And that is where the story turns from the seabed to something much closer to home. Because the water kept the secret. The device kept the secret. The submarine kept the secret. The vulnerability was never really the cable. The vulnerability was memory. Human memory. Keep that word in mind. Because when Ivy Bells was finally compromised, it was not compromised by a Soviet patrol stumbling onto a strange object in the dark. It was not compromised by a failed dive or a captured submarine. The public record points somewhere far quieter. To a man who worked inside American intelligence, a man who did not need to steal a single document to give this operation away. His name enters the story later. For now, mark only this. The full operational record of Ivy Bells remains partly obscured by classification, by memoir, by secondary reconstruction, built years after the fact by people working from fragments. Which means some of what is confidently repeated about this mission should be held carefully. The exact value of what was collected. Some of the precise mechanics of the dives. These sit behind a wall that has never fully come down. What is not in doubt is the ambition of it. The sheer nerve of the concept. to reach into an enemy's most protected waters, to find a line no one thought could be found, and to listen to it without leaving a mark. The Americans had built a way to sit inside the Soviet Navy's own conversations. Quiet, patient, undetected. For a time, this was arguably one of the most productive windows the United States ever opened into Soviet naval communications. A window the Soviets did not know was there. A window they kept feeding, message after message, in the belief that the cold water of the Okhotsk Sea was all the security they needed. And here is the open loop that will run through everything that follows. Somewhere between the early 1970s and the mid-1980s, this operation went from an American secret to a Soviet certainty. The device stayed on the cable. The divers kept coming back. The recordings kept flowing. And the entire time, the ground was shifting beneath it. Not because of anything that happened in the water, but because of what one man carried in his head and what he decided to do with it. The story of Ivy Bells is usually told as a triumph of engineering. An induction tap on a Soviet cable, 400 feet down, that never had to touch the signal it stole. But the deeper story is about a mismatch between what a machine can protect and what a person can betray. The ocean held, the submarine held, the device held. The secret was lost anyway. How it was lost, who lost it, and how much of what we now believe about Ivy Bells is fact, and how much is later reconstruction dressed as fact. That is what we have to separate next, because the closer you look at this operation, the clearer one uncomfortable question becomes. We know the Americans were listening. The real question is when the Soviets started listening back. To answer that, you have to leave the seabed entirely. You have to go to Maryland, to an office building, to a man with a security clearance and a memory he was never supposed to share. His name was Ronald Pelton, and in the public record, he is described in stark terms. One of the most damaging cryptologic spies in the history of the National Security Agency. Understand what that phrase means. Cryptologic, signals intelligence, the business of breaking into other nations' communications and protecting your own. The exact business Ivy Bells belonged to. Pelton worked for the National Security Agency from 1965 to 1979. 14 years inside. 14 years of access to the projects, the methods, the targets. The programs aimed at the Soviet Union. He was not a spy when he was hired. He was an analyst. Trusted. Cleared. Sitting inside one of the most secretive institutions the United States had ever built. And this is the detail that changes the shape of the entire story. The danger was never that a document would go missing. Documents can be counted. Copies can be tracked. A missing file leaves a hole where it used to be. Pelton dealt in something that leaves no hole. He dealt in what he remembered. Because the public accounts emphasize one uncomfortable fact. Pelton did not primarily hand over stolen papers. He disclosed sensitive information from memory. Sit with that. A man walks out of a secure facility. He carries no briefcase full of classified pages. He passes no checkpoint with contraband under his coat. There is nothing to find. Nothing to seize. Nothing to prove he took anything at all. Everything he knew, he simply kept in his head. And later, when he chose to, he spoke it aloud. Now line up the dates, because the timing is the whole tragedy. Pelton left the National Security Agency in 1979. He began selling to the Soviet Union in 1980, and he continued until 1985. which means the betrayal did not happen while he still had a desk and a badge. It happened after. He had left the building, but he had not left the knowledge behind. He carried out 5 years of employment inside American Signals Intelligence, and then he sold it, piece by piece, from recall to the KGB. Among the projects he is documented as compromising: Ivy Bells, the effort to secretly tap Soviet undersea communications cables; the same operation, the Induction device, the Submarine, the dives, the cable on the floor of the Sea of Okhotsk. A man who had never touched that cable, who may never have gone anywhere near the water, held enough of the secret in his memory to give it away. And when he did, the Soviets did not need to send a patrol out looking for a strange object in the dark. They could be told exactly where to look, exactly what to look for, exactly what it was. Now return to that operation still running beneath the sea, the divers still coming back, the recordings still flowing, the Americans still believing the ocean was keeping their secret. Somewhere in those years, between 1980 and 1985, the ground shifted. The window the United States had opened into Soviet naval communications was no longer a window the Soviets did not know about. It may have become a window they could watch. And here the story grows careful again. Because the exact moment the Soviets learned, and exactly what they did with that knowledge, sits behind the same wall of classification and reconstruction that covers so much of this operation. Public accounts describe the connection between Pelton and Ivy Bells emerging in the mid-1980s. Materials in the Central Intelligence Agency's reading room show that press reporting in that period connected the Pelton case to a project code-named Ivy Bells. That is the trail that reaches the public. A spy case, a code name. Newspapers in the 1980s printing a phrase that had spent years buried on the ocean floor. But notice what the public record gives you and what it withholds. It gives you a name, Pelton. It gives you a method, disclosure from memory. It gives you a window of years, 1980 to 1985. And it gives you a link, reported in the press, between the man and the operation. What it does not give you, cleanly, is the sequence that intelligence services care about most, when, precisely, the tap was compromised. What precisely the Soviets did once they knew. Whether the Americans kept feeding a device that was already blown. Whether the take in those final years was real intelligence or something the Soviets were content to let flow. These are exactly the details that sit behind classification, memoir, and secondary reconstruction. The kind of details that get filled in later, confidently, by people working from fragments. And this is where you have to hold two things at once. The betrayal is documented. Pelton is real. His employment is real. His years selling to the KGB are real. His compromise of Ivy Bells is stated plainly in the public record. But the fine mechanics of how the operation ended, the exact chain from one man's memory to a Soviet response on the seabed, is not something the open record hands over in full. So resist the temptation to tell it too neatly. The clean version says a spy sold a secret, the Soviets found the tap, and the case closed. The record is not that clean. Pelton's betrayal is documented. His compromise of Ivy Bells is documented. But the underwater half of the ending is harder to see. The public file shows the human leak more clearly than the Soviet response it triggered. And here the two threads of this story finally cross. The engineering thread, 400 feet down, all restraint and patience and machines that never had to touch the thing they stole. And the human thread, a cleared analyst in Maryland, walking out of a building with everything still intact. The machines held, the ocean held, the submarine held. The device wrapped around that cable never failed at the one job it was built to do, and none of it mattered. Because the weakest point in the entire operation was never anything the Soviets could have found by searching the water. It was a person who already knew. Consider the bitter symmetry of it. The whole genius of the tap was that it never touched the cable. No cut, no pierce, no mark. The whole failure of the operation was a man who never touched a document. No theft, no missing file, no mark. Two forms of the same quiet danger. Something taken without leaving a trace. One was American ingenuity, the other was American exposure, and they were mirror images of each other, running at the same time, beneath the same secret. So the question we opened with sharpens now. We know the Americans were listening. The real question is when the Soviets started listening back. Whether they moved the moment Pelton spoke, whether they waited, whether they used what they knew, or simply let the Americans exhaust themselves servicing a device that had already gone quiet. Those answers live in the part of the file that has never fully opened. The exact collection value, the precise mission mechanics, the Soviet response, all of it framed in the honest accounts with caution. Because so much of what surrounds Ivy Bells is memoir and reconstruction, layered over a core of documented fact. And separating the two is harder than it looks. That is what remains when the water clears. A documented spy, a documented operation, and a stretch of ocean and a stretch of memory that still refuse to give up the last of what they know. What we can say with confidence is where the danger lived. Not in the cold water, in the ordinary quiet of a working life. Pelton was, by every account, unremarkable to look at. A man with a clearance, a man with a memory, a man who had spent 14 years learning the shape of American secrets. And when he left, in 1979, the institution he left behind treated his departure the way institutions always do. A badge returned, a file closed, a name moved from active to former. But the knowledge did not move with the paperwork. The knowledge went home with him. Now step back and look at the mismatch this creates. An operation like Ivy Bells was built on layers of protection. The submarine modified in ways that were themselves secret. The dives restricted to a handful of trained men. The device engineered so it left no mark. The location hidden inside Soviet home waters where no casual eye would ever fall on it. Every one of those layers was designed to defeat an outside searcher, a Soviet patrol, a repair crew, a trawler dragging its net across the wrong patch of seabed. The entire security model assumed the threat came from the water, and none of it was designed for the threat that actually arrived. A man who already had the answers, standing on dry land, on the other side of the ocean. This is the complication that the clean version of the story never quite sits with. The operation could survive almost anything the Soviets could do in the Sea of Okhotsk. What it could not survive was a single insider deciding to talk. And here the timeline does something cruel. Consider the overlap. The device on that cable did not stop working when Pelton left in 1979. The public accounts describe an operation that depended on returning, on repeated retrieval, on divers going back to the same line, again and again, swapping out what had been captured. So picture the two clocks running side by side. One clock on the seabed, still turning. Recordings still gathering. missions still being planned and risked and carried out. The other clock, on land, beginning in 1980. A former analyst making contact with the KGB, selling, from memory, the projects he had learned inside the National Security Agency. Among them, by the documented record, Ivy Bells. For a stretch of years, both clocks ran together. The Americans staking men and submarines on a secret they believed was still theirs, and the secret, piece by piece, moving into Soviet hands. That overlap is the tension at the heart of this entire affair. Not the dive, not the device, the gap. The gap between when a secret is compromised and when its owners realize it. Because in that gap, everything looks normal. The cable still worked, the device still recorded, the submarine still returned. Every visible sign said the operation was healthy, and none of those signs could show what was happening in a series of conversations thousands of miles away. This is what makes insider betrayal so different from any other kind of failure. A failed dive announces itself. A captured submarine announces itself. A discovered device leaves evidence on the seabed. But a man selling secrets from memory produces no signal at all. There is no leak in the water to trace, no malfunction to investigate, no hole in a filing cabinet to notice. The operation keeps performing. The confidence keeps building. And underneath it, the ground has already gone soft. Now hold this carefully, because here the record grows thin again. We know Pelton sold to the KGB between 1980 and 1985. We know Ivy Bells is documented among what he compromised. What the open record does not lay out cleanly is the reaction on the other side, how quickly the Soviets moved. What exactly they did once they understood what was sitting on their cable. Whether they raced to the water or waited and watched and calculated. Those are the mechanics that stay behind the wall, and it is worth naming why they stay there. A service that discovers its communications have been tapped faces a choice. Rip out the device and reveal that you know, or leave it and control what flows through the line. Which of those the Soviets chose and when is precisely the kind of detail the honest accounts refuse to state with confidence. Because so much of it comes from memoir and reconstruction, assembled after the fact. The temptation is to fill the silence with a clean ending. Resist it. What the documented record gives us is a beginning we can see clearly. A man, a memory, a window of years, a compromised operation, and an ending that stays, deliberately, out of focus. So the escalation here is not a chase across the seabed. It is quieter than that, and worse. It is the slow realization, on the American side, that the finest engineering in the world had been built to guard against the wrong threat. That every layer of protection pointed outward, at the water, at the enemy's patrols. And the failure walked in from the one direction no submarine could cover. A cleared man, remembering and choosing to sell. The device never had to touch the cable. The spy never had to touch a document. And between those two facts sits the whole uncomfortable lesson of Ivy Bells. That the ocean can keep a secret. The machine can keep a secret. And a person alone can undo both. What remains now is the hardest part to see. Not the tap, not the traitor, but the space between them. The years the operation ran on borrowed confidence. The exact point where American ingenuity turned into American exposure. And whether anyone on the American side knew, in time, that the window they had opened was no longer theirs alone. That is the question the open record leaves unanswered, and it is worth staying with rather than rushing past it. Because the way this story is usually told, it ends with a kind of clean justice. The spy is named, the operation is exposed, the books are closed. But look again at what we actually hold. We hold a documented operation, Ivy Bells, an American undersea signals intelligence effort against Soviet cables. We hold a submarine, the USS Halibut, modified for work no ordinary warship performs. We hold an induction device that listened without cutting, without piercing, without leaving a mark. We hold a location 400 feet down in the Sea of Okhotsk, and we hold a man, Ronald Pelton, 14 years inside the National Security Agency, 5 years selling to the KGB, from memory, from 1980 to 1985. Documented in the public record as one of the most damaging cryptologic spies in that agency's history. Documented as having compromised Ivy Bells among other projects. All of that is established. All of that we can say plainly. What we cannot say cleanly is the shape of the ending. And that gap is not an accident. It is the residue of an operation that was never fully declassified. Think about how much of what surrounds Ivy Bells reaches us secondhand, through memoir, through press reporting in the mid-1980s, which connected the Pelton case to a codename, through reconstruction, assembled by writers and analysts working from fragments, years after the fact, layer upon layer of retelling, each one confident, each one filling a little more of the silence, and underneath all of it, a core of documented fact that is far smaller than the story that grew on top of it. So separate the two, one last time. What is fact? The operation existed. The tap existed. The spy existed. The compromise is on the record. What is reconstruction? The exact value of the intelligence collected. The precise mechanics of the dives. The Soviet response and its timing. Whether the Americans kept servicing a device that was already known, whether the final years of recordings were genuine intelligence, or something the Soviets were content to let flow. Those sit behind the wall. And the honest thing to do is to leave them there, marked as open rather than dressing them in a confidence the record does not support. Now step all the way back. Ask the question this operation was really built to answer. What did Ivy Bells reveal? One reading says it revealed Soviet confidence. A navy so certain of its home waters that it sent sensitive traffic down a cable it never thought to encrypt heavily. A trust that the cold, enclosed sea would do the work that ciphers usually do. Another reading says it revealed Soviet vulnerability, that even a private lake ringed by defenses could be reached. That 400 feet of dark water was not the barrier the Soviets believed it to be. And a third reading, quieter than the other two, says it revealed the limits of American underwater espionage. That the most elegant tap ever placed on an enemy line was still, in the end, only as secure as the memory of every person who knew it existed. Those three readings do not fully agree, and the open record does not force a choice between them. That, too, is worth sitting with. Because it means the deepest question about Ivy Bells is not what the device heard. It is what the operation, as a whole, teaches. And what it teaches cuts against the instinct that built it. The instinct that says a secret is safest when it is hardest to reach. Everything about Ivy Bells was designed around that instinct. Reach further than the enemy expects. Hide deeper than the enemy will look. Engineer a device so subtle it leaves no evidence at all. And all of that worked. The reaching worked. The hiding worked. The device worked. The secret was lost anyway. Not to the water, not to a patrol, Not to a repair crew dragging a strange object up from the seabed. To a man on dry land who carried the answer out in his head and chose, years later, to speak it. That is the symmetry the story keeps returning to. A tap that never touched the cable. A traitor who never took a document. Two ways of moving a secret without leaving a mark. One of them was the triumph. The other was the ruin. And they belonged to the same operation, running at the same time, beneath the same silence. So here is where the file closes, still incomplete. The Americans found the cable. The device worked. The recordings moved from the seabed to Washington. Then, somewhere between 1980 and 1985, the knowledge moved the other way, into Soviet hands. The missing piece is the moment those two clocks met, the moment an American listening post became a Soviet certainty. If that moment is written down, it is still behind a door the public file has not opened. That is why Ivy Bells remains more than a submarine story. It is a story about two kinds of silence. The engineered silence of a tap that never pierced the cable, and the human silence of a man who carried the operation in memory until he decided to sell it. The ocean kept the machine hidden. The file kept much of the ending hidden, but memory did not keep the secret. And that is where Operation Ivy Bells still refuses to close.